You know you live a lie. You don't really know it consciously, but you are Jewish, and you can't say, because if you say it, you don't know what will happen. In fact, you know what will happen. So that affected my life. I mean, many, many years after I came to Canada, I never told anybody. So it was a long process for me, and I didn't even know what Jew was, because, you know, we were not brought up religious. And yes, it affected me greatly. I didn't feel the world was a safe place, ever. My name is Kati Morrison. I was born in 1940, September, in Budapest, Hungary. My parents moved out from my mother's parents' place in order to start a family, and so we had a 2-room apartment. I lived there with them for 3 years before the war started. I was admired, and my father made poems about every milestone I made. I was a very happy kid. Especially that I was born right after my maternal grandfather died. So my birth was really giving a lot of uplift for the family. And I talked very early, and when you talk about neighborhood, when you live in a 4 or 5 story building, the neighbors are all around the corridor. And it was a very safe world, so as soon as I could walk, I would walk to the neighbors, and they would love to have me there. So I would be chatting with them, and it was perfectly safe. And so I went and asked if they had any candy. My mother forbade me to ask for candy, and I said I never asked to give it to me. I just asked if they had any. So it was a very comfortable life. We had a housekeeper, and you know, she was very nice to me, and that's all I can say, that it was a very happy time. And then, of course, my sister was born in 1943, yes. My grandfather passed away I was 6 weeks old. He was a surgeon, a urologist. He and my grandmother, who was the first woman ophthalmologist in Budapest, Hungary, which will be significant later on in my story, they had a big 6-room apartment, and they had each of them their medical office. Now, this was many years before the actual persecution, but to find a job for Jewish doctors was very difficult. So, so my grandfather worked for free clinics a lot, apart from his office, and my grandmother became a doctor in a school. So apart from having her office as an ophthalmologist at home. My father was a trained rabbi because he wanted to go to medical school, but it was not possible for Jews to go to university at that time, and he did not have any means of support. So he went to the seminary, became a rabbi, but never functioned as a rabbi. He was teaching religion in high school. So around the time I was born, he was in a Berzsenyi high school, and that again is quite significant because the students there were discriminated against way before the actual persecution started, and they were not allowed to join the Boy Scouts because they were Jews. So my father organized a hiking group every Sunday. The students and in her class and their parents, they were all included. They went hiking every Sunday. My mother wasn't too happy about that. So my mother was a piano teacher, And at that time, there was no job given to a music teacher, so she had private students, and she spent all day going from house to house teaching students piano before the war. My grandparents had a more observant household, and ours was as much as it was necessary for my father's profession. He didn't really believe in a lot of rituals, and I don't remember for the first few years of my life anything relating to being raised Jewish. Sometime in 1944, when we had to leave our house, our apartment, and we had to move to designated houses, which had a star on them, that's where Jews could live. And the apartment where we lived in was not one of those houses, so we basically had to evacuate. And that I remember vividly because we hired a man with a wagon, and he pulled it, and all our belongings were on it. If you've seen the Fiddler on the Roof, it was very similar. But for me as a child, I thought it was fun. We were walking on the street behind this man, and my parents were walking together to bring all our belongings, what we could bring, to my grandmother's house, because that was a house which was Jews were allowed to go. Yeah, so we moved over there. It was early 1944 when all the restrictions were what I remember, that I could not go to any park. I couldn't go anywhere on the street. And so I couldn't go out to play, which was the major thing what parents did with their children. They took them to the park every day, so we were not allowed. My parents had to wear a yellow star. I remember when they were sewing it on. I liked life in my grandmother's building, you see, so there were a lot of people around. And I remember very clearly that my grandmother, because she had a big apartment, and by that time, you know, she wasn't working, so she basically opened the door for other people who had to go to a specially designated Jewish house, people she did not know. So we had a couple of older women from a Jewish retirement home, and we had an actor's Jewish partner who was there. We had another couple, so the house was full with people. And there were bombings. The sirens were going regularly. And so we had to, the sirens went, then we had to run down to the cellar. I could say that the one thing which was difficult for me was that my sister was a baby, and if she did not get food, she was screaming from the top of her lungs. So the sirens came, and the first thing everybody did, rushing to make food, because if they don't bring food to the cellar, then everybody will be mad at us that we are letting her scream. So I kind of felt ignored. That was the one thing that I do remember. And once actually everybody went to the cellar, and I hid under a bed. And I just thought, you know, are they ever going to notice? So the parents were preoccupied. I don't remember anybody playing with me. I just watched what was going all around. So people were obviously very anxious, which I know now when I think back about it. But as a child, I felt like, you know, I don't matter as much as I did before, and I could just hide and nobody will know. And then, of course, they didn't want to go to the cellar without me. And I remember that one of the ladies who lived with us looked under the bed, and then she pulled me out. So that was the one thing. You know, my parents were amazing. They dressed us up, people in the cellar, and I mean, there were hundreds of people down there from a 4- or 5-story building. They said, you know, this family is thinking they are going to a party because they are always dressing up the girls. So, my parents really wanted to create an atmosphere of playfulness as much as it was humanly possible. As a child, the only thing I remember is when there was a gendarme or arrow cross downstairs, and I looked out, and they were collecting people to take them away. That was the only thing. I wasn't allowed to go out, right? So I only saw who came to the building. And it was one or two gendarmes, and the superintendent was pointing out where the Jews were in the building. And so if anybody didn't come down, and that was when they started to take them away, then they pointed out, oh, there is somebody up there. Yeah, so my father was taken away in October 1944, and my mother was taken away in November 1944. My grandmother told me that my mother went to be a soldier to protect the country. That's all she told me. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother before, and so it was a very smooth transition for me. My mother was working during the day, yeah. So when I was, as I was growing up, so I actually have to tell you, it was like I switched off, and I was with my grandmother, and I was feeling fine. My mother, they walked them to Austria, and then from there she went to Germany. She ended up liberated in Dachau. She was in Turkheim before. She was away until the following August 1945. They were liberated in April. And she developed tuberculosis. And while in hospital, she fell off a bed and broke her back, which was not even diagnosed or discovered until coming to Canada, like some 40 years later. So she wrote her memoirs, and the worst thing what happened to her was to be separated from her children. She said, I can forgive everything, but not that. Yeah, because, we both, my sister and I, became detached. And so what she kept her going was that she knew, she said, I know that they are alive. And so after the liberation, when they were able to go to different stores and take anything they wanted, she brought a huge knapsack full of toys. And that's how she came back with the toys, because, that was in her mind, that she'll come back to us. But the Hungarians never sent anybody for people who were liberated from concentration camps, so it took for her from April 27 to August to get home, to get transportation. Yeah. So after my father was gone, we still stayed in this apartment building. So I didn't see, anybody else. I was just in there. And my parents or my grandmother were allowed out for 2 hours a day. That I remembered. But I don't remember being hungry. I was just walking in the corridor and said his name. And I was very upset. And that was the one reaction I had. You learned very quickly not to react, even as a child, because they didn't want us to be aware or upset. My father was taken away with my uncle, and my mother was taken away with a neighbor girlfriend's mother. The two of them went away. And this girl is still a friend of mine. Okay, she searched me out just a few years ago. Her mother and my mother were taken away, and and her mother wanted to escape. And my mother said, you know, anybody who escapes will be shot. She said, but I want to go to my daughter. And so she got up and left, and she was shot. On that day, we had to move. So I don't remember the actual how we got there, but I remember the place where we went from there. And it was my grandmother, my grandmother's sister, Eiko, and my sister in a carriage, and I. So the four of us went to the so-called protective house. It was 4 or 5 stories. Again, we were not allowed out. So we were in about a 2-bedroom apartment, about 70 or 80 people. We had enough room to just lie down, even sometime on top of each other. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of yelling, a lot of crying going on. So, you know, my grandmother somehow managed to get some food from home. So she fed us when we were there, and my sister was in a carriage. So at least, you know, her space was guaranteed. And so I just had a little basket, what was the only thing I had as a toy, so to speak, what I got from my paternal grandmother, and I carried that with me. And I was just watching the adults. I was just watching the adults because, you know, at that time, children were not mixing with adults in normal conversations. So I kind of liked the crowd, and I liked the kerfuffle. I don't know exactly about our particular situation, but I know that it was a protected house, and there were really a few very heroic people like Wallenberg and a few other people who were giving protective papers to people as if we were under their jurisdiction. So I'm not sure what kind of protective papers my grandmother had that allowed us to go to this building. So that was before we went to the ghetto, so that was supposed to be protective. But every day a family was taken away and shot, and everybody was killed from that building later on. So the Arrow Cross went there regardless of that being protected. I think from the 70,000 who were in a ghetto, 20,000 were in protective houses originally. What happened was on the 3rd of January, which I found out later, the date, Arrow Cross came to the building and asked everybody from the whole building, everybody come downstairs. There were several hundred people in this, 4 or 5 story building, and gathered behind the courtyard around the staircase and line up. I had no idea what it was about, but there was an Arrow Cross man who looked at my grandmother and did like this. And my grandmother went and pulled us under the staircase, where it was sort of a shady spot. But her sister, Eiko, started to scream that, "Don't take the children, don't take the children." And my grandmother said, "Come back, don't run, just stay here with me." And she went right across, and the Arrow Cross man just said, "Get to the line." And that was the last we saw her. So that was my grandmother's sister. So then we know that everybody from that building were taken to the shore of the Danube and shot. So that is what we found out, that's what happened, and that's what commemorates the shoes, which have been done there in 2005 to commemorate the thousands of Jews who were shot to the river during this period of time. My grandmother told after the war to my parents later that he recognized her as he was her patient, and that's how her being an ophthalmologist saved our life. and also her presence, her state of mind, that she was able to read the sign and hide us. And they all went. And so that was, you could say, a miracle, really, that it happened, yeah. But then the house was firebombed. So what do you do when you are there with a baby and a small child? First she went upstairs, which anybody would have been shot just going back up because she had no food with her. She went up to the apartment where we were, and with her fist she broke down the lock and brought some food and came down, and the house was the whole building was then firebombed. That was the war. And so what is she to do? So there she peeked out to the main courtyard, and on the other side the door was open, and on the other side of the street people were waving to her to come. Because Jews were not allowed to be on the street, and you can't go anywhere but to Jewish houses. So there she was, my sister in the carriage, and told me not to look. I remember that. But of course I did look, because I found it fascinating. It was like sparkling everywhere, fire. And later on I asked a friend of mine, I told her the story to make a painting out of that experience. And then we went across. We went to the other side, and then people allowed us in and gave us some hot chocolate and some warm clothes. But it was a Christian house. We were not allowed to stay there. And so they directed us to where the ghetto was. So we went we walked over to the ghetto from this protected house, so to speak, yeah. In the ghetto, we had a tiny room, which probably was a small washing room or a bathroom, or a larger bathroom. And we were there. There was a 100-year-old lady with her nurse, and my grandmother, my sister, and I. It was a very small space, which I did not mind. And there was a big cupboard, and my grandmother, and we had a mattress on the floor. That was it. And so we slept on the mattress. We ate on the mattress. We sat down there, and my grandmother would give 1 spoon barley. That was what we ate. We were given barley every day, and 1 spoon for my sister and 1 spoon for me. And actually, because she was a doctor, they gave her the job of a coroner in the building, because people died there right and left of starvation, of sickness, and there was no doctor or treating anything. And so they gave her double amount of food, and actually she gave us all her food. And so there was a bag of dry pea on the top of the cupboard, and that's what she chewed. I just remembered she always chewed on something, and so that's what I found out later. So we had our head behind the cupboard, because the big window towards the courtyard, we were on the ground floor. If there is shooting, then they could get us through the window. So my grandmother made sure, and I kind of liked to be sort of cozy there, the 3 of us. And then my grandmother also was teaching my sister. I mean, you know, by that time my sister was over a year old, a year and 4 months, and she taught her singing. She knew about 50 or 80 songs. She was singing to her. Taking care is not a concept, okay, at that time. Now there was this 100-year-old lady with a nurse in our same room. So I kind of presumed later that that she was watching, but there was nowhere to go. And so, you know, she closed the door. There was a cellar downstairs where sometimes I went, and there were some children there. But, you know, that's what I remember. We were there for about more than 2 weeks. Yeah, because on the 18th of January, my father appeared at the door. And so the Budapest was liberated. It was 17th or 18th. The Russians came and they surrounded Budapest. So my father was in a work battalion, and they were placed in a place, arena, okay, where they sort of just slept on the beton, and he heard the news from word of mouth. People were telling that, you know, the Russians are coming and the end is over soon. And so just before it was over, he escaped. And again, people were not allowed to walk on the street, and he was almost shot. Like a bullet went like this beside his face. He escaped to look for us. And so he eventually found us in the ghetto, and that's when, so the next day, if the Russians did not surround, he would have been taken out to Germany. That was the plan. I remember that as clearly as it was yesterday. His face was just engraved in me, that I remember right away. I said his name, I called him Little Father. He wanted me to call him Apám, my father, but I was a child, and when he said, call me Apám, and I said Apám Ko, okay, which is Little Father. So that became his name. That is even on his gravestone. So when he arrived, I didn't notice he wore a child's clothes, a 13-year-old child's clothes. He lost 50 pounds. He was smiling, and my grandmother started to cry. I actually wrote a poem about that many, many years later, because at that time, I told my grandmother, why are you crying? People should be laughing, should be happy. And so then he came, and then my sister, you know, she didn't know him, but he did not force himself at all. You know, here I am. We were not a huggy family. But she started to sing, you know, and so that was, my father missed, of course, all the milestones in her life, but so that was the reunion. And so then we walked back to my grandmother's apartment, where we were before, right, with my father. So I just wanted to mention to you, there were dead people everywhere on the street when we were walking back, because people from the ghettos, if they were dead, they just put them out. So there were dead people, dead horses, dead soldiers on the street. And so I didn't know what it was, and my grandmother said they were sleeping. My father organized Jewish children's recuperation from the war to summer camp. So I was there for a few weeks, I don't know for how long, in Buda, which is not too far. It's just the other side of Pest. And he said, or somebody said, there will be a big surprise that my mother will be back the following Sunday, that he came to visit me on Sunday. And so then I saw my father, and there were two women on each side of him, and I guessed, because I had no clue which one was my mother, and I guessed right. So, you know, I was only 5, but I knew what to do. I ran to her, and as I said, we were not a huggy family. I ran and I gave her a big hug. And I was right, she was my mother. But because, you see, they shaved her hair, so she had very short hair, very different from what it was, and she blew up. She was a thin woman, but after the war, after the starvation, when people were fed and they blew up, they became very big. So she was not recognizable for me, okay? So that was the reunion, and she valued that I did that forever. So, you know, faking became a way of life, yeah? You don't ask yourself how you feel about things, you do what you have to do, yeah? Because you're very young, you learn that your voice doesn't matter, yeah? What matters is that you survive. And these are the people who care about you. But with my father, I had no issue about not remembering, but I did not remember my mother. Yeah. We survived, my parents, my sister and I, and my grandmother, and my uncle. So it was affecting me forever, that I don't have extended family, I don't have relatives like other people have. The other thing was that I knew, even though nobody said that I shouldn't talk about being Jewish, but the war affected me in that way, that being Jewish meant to be killed. So we always knew we were Jewish, but it was not reinforced because the family felt that they had to adapt. In fact, that's one of the things what my father wrote to the Jews in Hungary, and I have the article what he wrote in August 1945, that we are condemned to eternal mourning because we don't have a grave to our loved ones, and the events are in our conscience. It's going to be with us forever, and we will not be free until we die from the pain. But we need to keep it inside, and externally we have to be calm, and we have to adapt, and we need to forgive people, not just with words, but forgive with our actions, that they were misled, and we are all Hungarians, and so I have seen no hatred in my home. There was no revenge, there was no mention of who did this to us. They were real idealists, unfortunately. It helped me as a child, but it affected me in a long way, because you live a lie. You don't really know it consciously, but you are Jewish, and you can't say, because if you say it, you don't know what will happen. In fact, you know what will happen. So that affected my life. I mean, many, many years after I came to Canada, I never told anybody. So it was a long process for me, and I didn't even know what Jew was, because we were not brought up religious. And yes, it affected me greatly. I didn't feel the world was a safe place, ever, yeah, until I came to Canada.